500,000 Americans are dead. Not from a war, not from a plague, but from a pill that a single family convinced the medical establishment was safe. And when the government finally looked into it, they found their own people had been on the payroll. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a matter of public court record. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to a family named Sackler. In the early 20th century, 3 brothers, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond, built a pharmaceutical fortune through a company called Purdue Frederick. Arthur in particular was a genius at something the drug industry had never quite seen before: marketing medicine directly to doctors. He understood that if you could shape a physician's perception of a drug, you could shape what ended up in a patient's body. Arthur Sackler died in 1987, before OxyContin existed. But the infrastructure he built, the sales force, the relationships, the philosophy that a drug's image was as important as its chemistry, that infrastructure lived on. In 1995, Purdue Pharma, the renamed and restructured family company, received FDA approval for a new opioid painkiller. Its active ingredient was oxycodone. Its release mechanism, the company claimed, made it far less addictive than existing opioids. That claim would define the next 30 years. The claim rested on a single idea: that OxyContin's time-release formula meant the drug entered the bloodstream slowly, reducing the euphoric surge that drives addiction. Purdue's internal researchers had data on this. What they also had, according to later court findings, was data suggesting the abuse potential was far higher than they were telling anyone. The company chose one set of numbers for the public and kept the other set internal. That decision, made in a conference room somewhere in Connecticut, would eventually kill more Americans than the Vietnam War. The sales operation that followed was unlike anything the medical world had seen. Purdue deployed an army of roughly 500 sales representatives whose sole job was to visit doctors and persuade them to prescribe OxyContin, not just for cancer pain, the original target, but for back pain, arthritis, everyday chronic conditions. Representatives were given performance bonuses tied directly to the volume of opioids prescribed in their territory. The more pills in circulation, the bigger the check. Some of those representatives later testified they knew patients were becoming addicted. They kept visiting. Purdue also cultivated something subtler: a network of physicians it identified as high-volume prescribers and flew to resort conferences in places like Boca Raton and Scottsdale. These were framed as medical education events. They were, in practice, a form of relationship building that blurred the line between information and incentive. Doctors came home from these weekends with a favorable view of OxyContin and a company contact who would call them every few weeks to maintain that view. This was not illegal at the time. It was simply very effective. By the late 1990s, warning signs were appearing in places Purdue could not ignore. Emergency rooms in rural Appalachia began reporting a surge in oxycodone overdoses. Police in Maine and Virginia started flagging OxyContin as the drug most commonly found on arrested addicts. A few investigative journalists started asking questions. Purdue's response was disciplined and well-resourced. They hired lobbyists. They funded patient advocacy organizations that pushed back against the idea that opioids were dangerous, and they quietly settled lawsuits before they reached discovery. The role of the FDA in this story is where it becomes genuinely uncomfortable. The official who led the review that approved OxyContin in 1995 was a physician named Curtis Wright. The label he approved contained language about addiction risk that was, according to later analysis, unsupported by the clinical evidence Purdue had actually submitted. Roughly 2 years after that approval, Curtis Wright left the FDA and took a job at Purdue Pharma. His starting salary, according to court documents, was approximately $400,000 a year. Purdue has never admitted this was a quid pro quo. The timing speaks for itself. The early 2000s brought the first serious legal reckoning. Several state attorneys general began building cases. In 2007, Purdue Pharma and 3 of its executives pleaded guilty to federal charges of misbranding OxyContin, specifically to misleading doctors and consumers about the drug's addiction risk. The fine was $600 million for a company that had generated, by that point, an estimated $35 billion in revenue from OxyContin alone. This was not a deterrent. It was, effectively, a licensing fee. The Sackler family paid the settlement from the company. Their personal fortunes remained untouched. The addiction wave did not recede after 2007. It accelerated. When regulators eventually made OxyContin harder to abuse, reformulating the pill so it could not easily be crushed and snorted, many of the people who had become dependent on it simply switched to heroin, which was cheaper and increasingly available. The opioid crisis morphed and spread in ways that now implicated not just Purdue, but the entire ecosystem it had helped create. Other manufacturers, distributors, pharmacy chains. The original sin, though, had been committed by one company in one decade. In 2019, facing a wave of lawsuits from nearly every state in the country, Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy. The Sackler family negotiated a settlement that would, at various points, have shielded them from further civil liability in exchange for contributing roughly $6 billion from their personal wealth. Wealth estimated at the time at somewhere between $10 and $13 billion. A Supreme Court ruling in 2024 complicated that shield, sending the settlement back for renegotiation. As of this writing, the legal architecture around the family's personal accountability remains unresolved. What the Purdue story exposes is not a single act of corporate greed. It is a structural failure across multiple systems simultaneously. A regulator captured by the industry it was meant to police. A legal system that treats fines as costs of doing business rather than punishments. A medical profession that accepted industry hospitality as education. A political class that received campaign contributions from pharmaceutical companies for 2 decades while constituents died. Every one of these failures had been identified and written about before OxyContin was even approved. None of them were fixed in time to matter. The Sackler name has been removed from museum wings and university buildings around the world. The Louvre, the Tate, the Guggenheim. Institutions that once competed for Sackler philanthropic dollars have, quietly or publicly, taken the name down. This is perhaps the most visible consequence the family has faced, a reputational accounting that the legal system has so far struggled to deliver. It is a strange kind of justice. 500,000 people are still dead. The pills are still on the market, made now by other companies. And the family, by most credible estimates, is still worth several $billions.